much, Patricio. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a very simple slide presentation for the audience. And I would like to know, does that work?
Yeah, we can all see it now. It's
okay, amazing. Okay, well, I'd like to start with a confession in Spanish. So, tristemente yo hablo solamente un poco español y necesito práctica, pero no hoy. Estoy presentado en inglés y gracias por su comprensión. I was so delighted to receive an invitation to participate in CEDIM's Innovation Webinar Series and to learn more about its unique innovation and design thinking programming. I am a very big fan of Mexico. I've had the privilege to travel to diverse regions of your country on 6 different occasions over the past 30 years. From El Chepe in Chihuahua to Palenque in Chiapas, from Dia de los Muertos in Oaxaca to Las Playas in Tulum. I have spent over 6 months meeting wonderful people, eating incredible food, and simply falling in love with your country. So it's such an honor to speak to a design community based in Mexico today. Before I begin with my presentation, I'd like to let you know that today I'm located in the interior of British Columbia in Canada. So our country has entered a process of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people. And in the spirit and in support of that process, I would like to recognize and respect that I am on the unceded ancestral Secwepemc territory. And I express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here today. I'd love to get a sense of who is participating on the webinar today. So please, I encourage you to share your information in the chat. Who's here? You know, are you a designer or a design practitioner? Do you work in sustainability and resilience? Are you simply curious about how these 2 things might work together? I encourage you to please just take a few seconds to pop your information in the chat, and let's start a community on this call. I do hope this will be an interactive session, and the team at CEDIM is going to help manage the chat so we can continue a conversation after my brief presentation on sustainability, resilience, and the role of design. And just so you know, my slide deck will also be shared along with a brief blog about today's topics. And that slide deck will include a number of links to the topics that I touch on today. So please expect that in the next few days. Okay. So today we're covering the intersection of 2 topics that are of utmost importance to me, and I believe to all of us and our collective future on this beautiful shared planet of ours, Earth. The first topic is sustainability and resilience. So as Patricio mentioned, my experience in this field has spanned over 15 years. So I am the team leader at Black Current, which is a boutique marketing and design agency. And we work exclusively with clients who are developing low carbon solutions to climate change. So a lot of clean tech and work in the sustainable building and sustainable finance community. So I have had a lot of exposure to climate related information, ideas, and innovation. I'm also one of a group of women who started a nonprofit organization called WIRE, Women in Renewable Energy. And WIRE's mission is to elevate the role and recognition of women working in the clean energy space. Originally in Canada, WIRE has now expanded to a number of different countries around the world. And so that was an early step into understanding some of the social justice and social impact work that's related to climate. And work with these organizations was very satisfying and always very busy. And we engaged in lots of inspiring projects with great people. But several years ago, I found myself feeling quite frustrated with the level of impact that our solutions were making. And so to try and deal with that feeling, I started to look for new tools and new ways in which to make positive change. And that's when I discovered the second topic of today's discussion, design. And not just simply design, but human-centered design thinking as a problem identifying and problem-solving practice. So I had a very rich and illuminating academic experience at OCADU in Toronto in the Strategic Foresight and Design program. And we investigated the potential for positive change using design thinking, systems thinking, and strategic foresight. And so over the course of several years, our cohort learned and applied these new skills to investigate many real-world problems in real time, and did a number of group projects to consider how we might solve for those problems. And I've since brought those approaches back to my clients at Blackcurrant. And I also am continuing the work of designing for resilience through a professional training program called Designing ESG. And I'll touch on that a little bit later on, because that's where a lot of the insights that I'll share today were generated. So today we'll talk about sustainability and resilience. We'll talk about how design thinking adds value to be able to amplify innovation and the impact of solutions that are addressing today's most pressing challenges. So when we say resilience, what do we mean? And this is a great opportunity for you to put your ideas down in the chat. A textbook definition of resilience is our ability to recover from or to adjust to change. And I would add, to benefit from change. Of course, the challenge with change is that we often don't know things are going to change until they do. And there is a whole discipline around getting ahead of change through futures thinking and strategic foresight. And those practices consider what are the trends and the drivers of change that are happening now? What are we noticing? And how might those changes amplify into the future? So what might the future hold and how can we act in it? Now, in turbulent times, which I would suggest today we are in turbulent times, it's hard not to get overwhelmed by these types of questions. But my perspective is, as acclaimed futurist Stuart Candy says, the future we imagine is the future that we create. There are multiple futures and we are designing them every day. So I think we're responsible to try and design the positive future that we want and that we need. So when we start with that, I find it very helpful to keep major drivers of change top of mind when I look at what might be. And so Toronto futurist Leah Zadie has suggested that if you're going to look at only 3 drivers of change, these are the 3 that are affecting everything and everyone. One is climate change and the havoc it will wreak. Those are her words, but we're seeing climate change impact around the world all the time and more frequently. The second is the battle for an equal, just, and democratic society. The types of social impacts that we're seeing from climate, from democracy, from business, etc. And the rise of artificial intelligence. And she actually published these 3 trends probably a couple of years ago. And we've certainly seen a lot of information and a lot of movement in artificial intelligence. I'm seeing that a couple of people are raising their hands. If you don't mind, why don't you pop your questions in the chat and we'll come back to ask them at the end. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. So these 3 trends, what do they have to do with resilience and sustainability? Well, as mentioned, the incidences of climate change and social disruption are happening more and more frequently, and often with increasing impact. And evidence is showing that these types of events are going to become more frequent. So how do we respond to these urgent conditions? How do we become resilient in the face of change? Until recently, organizations and companies were setting their own agendas in terms of sustainability plans, making choices in terms of environmental and social impacts, driven in large part by their own ideas and their own preferences on how to act. And this sort of internally driven response was coined corporate social responsibility, or CSR. But CSR wasn't a satisfactory solution for many stakeholders. Investors and funders in particular were asking for evidence that companies were preparing for environmental and social impacts of the future, and that they were building those insights into the implications for their business model, for their valuation, in their accounting. So this took place at the same time as there's been growing legislation like carbon pricing and net zero mandates that governments are moving to put into place. So it's from these places of funder and regulatory pressure that a new framework arose for sustainability called ESG. So ESG stands for Environment, Social, and Governance. And ESG is the de facto sustainability and resilience model that is in play now for businesses and organizations. Now, you may have heard of some recent controversies about ESG, but it is not going away. The frameworks are simply evolving as climate disclosures are being built into legislation, including many jurisdictions like Europe, Canada, and the United States. So if you want, as a designer or as a professional, if you want to make an impact in sustainability and resilience, you need to understand ESG. Now, my personal understanding of ESG has evolved because I've had the good fortune to work with and collaborate with Karen Malone. She is an ESG strategist based in Toronto. She works with corporate clients to develop ESG strategy development and implementation. And she also trains and has trained hundreds of executives on ESG at the Center for Sustainability and Excellence. So in a recent partnership, Karen and I have co-designed and co-facilitated a coaching program called Designing ESG, where we take a diverse group of participants through a 6-week process that brings together the fundamentals of ESG with strategic design practices so that they can design and implement a more impactful ESG strategy for their organization. So with credit where it's due, much of what I know about the current versions of ESG, I've learned from Karen. And so unfortunately, she was unable to join me today, but with her blessing, I'm happy to share many of the insights and the knowledge that we've learned through the Designing ESG program. So in the name of resilience and sustainability, let's take a few more minutes to become familiar with ESG. We know it stands for Environment, Social, and Governance. We know it was driven by investor and funder demands. But what exactly is it? So the Harvard Law School says ESG is a means by which companies can evaluate and be evaluated with respect to a broad range of socially desirable ends. At the same time, it provides a range of business and investment opportunities. So in short, it evaluates impacts. It is used to inform risks and choices from a strategic perspective. And it also allows external stakeholders to be able to measure value. So ESG is different from previous forms of sustainability because it's driven largely from outside an organization, and it needs to respond to external stakeholder needs. And so it's not simply responding to legislation and investor pressure. No, customers are increasingly looking for purpose-driven products and services. Now, many professionals, especially young workers, are actively seeking work with purpose. Partnerships are based on transparent or value-aligned considerations and relationships. So ESG is very much an example of a design that is driven by external pressures. So how does ESG actually show up? So if we look at environmental impacts, we could consider greenhouse gas emissions as an environmental impact, waste and energy, biodiversity, and organizations' environmental policies, And I'm sure you could think of other ways in which environmental impacts and considerations can be measured. Those are examples of E and ESG. From a social perspective, ESG shows up through diversity and inclusion, for example, from safety measures or health benefits, from the way that labor is managed, how the organization deals with human rights or community impacts, and many other types of examples of social impacts. And then governance considers boards and executive leadership and the implications of their strategic decisions. It looks at compensation, risk management, disclosures, and other reporting roles. So these are the ways in which ESG can show up, but you can see that it covers a wide range of business functions that are already in play. So it's not an add-on, but it's an example of human-centered design response to disruptive forces. And given the wide range of stakeholder implications, it can most certainly be considered as a strategic imperative. It can offer competitive advantage and market leadership opportunities, all while impacting resilience in the face of ongoing change. So where would one start if one wanted to start with ESG? So there are a number of tools and frameworks available to help ESG get started within an organization. And to establish a baseline, many focus on building a fundamental understanding of what is material to their business. And materiality just basically means information that would influence a stakeholder's decision to invest or fund or engage with your organization. Business materiality is financial materiality. It hits the bottom line and requires accurate and complete disclosure. So there are a number of different frameworks and tools like the SASB standards, which offer tools to explore materiality for multiple industry sectors. And that's information and links that will be built into the slides and the blog. So these standards are developed using evidence-based market-informed processes, and they're very much modeled after financial accounting standards. So we know business materiality can be instigated using standards, but what's material for stakeholders? What would influence a decision to purchase your product, to partner with your organization, or even to join your workforce, right? What would people do? And what is that materiality to your organization? So there's when an emphasis to design thinking starts to come on board. So let's take a minute to consider, what is design thinking? Okay. At its core, design thinking is a problem finding and a problem solving process. It allows the researcher designer to focus on the people that they're creating for and the system they're creating within, to consider what's desirable to them, what's viable to their situation, and what's technically feasible. And this thoughtful process can lead to better products, better services, innovative processes, and in the case of programs like ESG, better buy-in. So if we look at the core concepts of design thinking, this double diamond, which I'm sure all the designers on this call have seen, it shows sort of the mechanics of the process. So on the left-hand side, we're looking to define a problem. And by doing that, we start by trying to understand the people that are involved or the actors that are involved in the problem area. And so our methodology focuses on empathetic research using ethnographic tools, right? Methods and frameworks to develop a deep understanding of what the audience is experiencing. And so that includes action learning, listening, observing. Another principle that's very key when we're looking at the problem area is the idea of inclusivity, that we want to widely understand and consider multiple options of how this space is moving. And so this requires taking the time and taking the space to actually challenge assumptions, to consider, do we need to redefine our problems? And how do we establish a genuine starting point so that we generate valuable new ideas and way forwards from the proper solving the right problems? And last, I would say, moving into the right-hand side of the problem solving solution area, that it adopts an iterative approach. So it uses a mindset of prototyping, of testing, of learning from, and evolving. As one of our profs, Helen Kerr, said at OCAD, this is slow, difficult work, not fast, easy work. And yet the outcomes can be so much more impactful and important. I'd also like to focus on the human factors that are built into the design thinking process. One is the emphasis on collaborative work and co-design, which really improves the viability for innovation because it activates the user insight. It leverages a diverse pool of those insights and ideas. And importantly, it brings people along to be able to heighten their enthusiasm and improve their buy-in. And last, that I really think is kind of to me, the fun part of design thinking is that it's a very creative approach. So there's an emphasis on using visual tools, which in my personal experience really allowed me to break free of a lot of stale thinking and move beyond words and lists and spreadsheets to actually unearth tacit knowledge through activities like storytelling, creating personas, exploring narratives. You're able to park some bias perhaps and make new connections. And so I think this process really activates creativity and curiosity, both in the designers and in the participant. So design thinking is useful for tackling complex problem areas like ESG because it serves to understand the human needs involved and reframe the problem that appears technical, like ESG, in human-centric ways. So we've considered design thinking as a toolkit to develop authentic, inclusive responses to problems. And we've taken a look at ESG as a pathway to address some of our pressing environmental and social issues and create resilient solutions. So what I'd like to do is actually look at some of the ways in which design thinking and ESG can work together. And I'd like to touch on 3 different examples before I open the floor to be able to talk about some of these ideas and answer questions with you. So the 3 different ideas and examples include understanding stakeholders to inform strategy, generating leadership buy-in, and building a dream team. And all 3 of these aspects are very important with ESG, and we'll talk a little bit about why. So let's start with understanding stakeholders. So for meaningful change, we want to make decisions about ESG that are strategically aligned. And to do so, we need to understand what is material for your business, but also for your stakeholders. So how do we understand what's material for stakeholders? We can break that down into parts. Right? Who are the stakeholders? How do they determine value in your organization? How might they be affected by E, S, and G topics? And then how do we actually serve that relationship as an organization? So adopting a design thinking approach, you might use a stakeholder mapping tool to start to unpack and explore who is impacted by your business and project. And you can look both ways. Who is impacting your business from outside? Who's your business context? And also who's within your business that are valued stakeholders. And then, for example, okay, using the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how are these diverse stakeholders influenced by DEI within your organization? How are they impacted? Who's driving it from the outside? Who's missing from the picture? So this exercise could be as simple as mapping on a whiteboard using sticky notes. And I love these flexible tools. They leave you with unlimited options to organize your information, maybe grouping stakeholders if you look for commonalities, or making connections, or establishing causality. So from an ESG perspective, as we go through these stakeholder mapping exercises, we often see that purpose is increasingly driving many of the decisions and the actions made by both internal and external stakeholders, from employees to customers to supply chain and everyone in between. When we think of purpose, I like to think of Simon Sinek's golden circle as a useful tool to bring this materiality exercise to life. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Simon Sinek, but he focused on the motivation behind why companies and people do what they do. And he believes and stated famously that leaders who start with the why get people to follow them willingly. So what he says is people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. They don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So considering this golden circle tool and this idea of purpose, perhaps as part of this exercise from a design thinking perspective, you could think, what is our purpose? What is our vision? Why do we do what we do? And then answering that question and placing it upon the stakeholder map. A designer might then start to make connections between the stakeholder groups and the purpose of the organization. And with these tools, you might be able to explore and gain insight into what is material for your stakeholders. Even by asking the questions and attempting to answer them, it will start to become apparent what is material and what questions still need to be asked in order to understand your stakeholder priorities. So this is an example of the utility of a design thinking approach specifically around ESG. It is relentlessly focused on the end users. It uses methods that spur new connections and identify gaps. It opens space to see what you know, what questions you might still need to ask before rushing in to problem solving. And then it explores those gaps and connections to deepen understanding. So you might be able to integrate them into more impactful and meaningful design solutions. Here's another example of a key element of ESG that's very important, which is bringing leadership on board. So this is a condition that has proven to be essential for an authentic response to ESG. Leaders are the gatekeepers to ESG delivery. They see the future. They have the best information to see the internal and external impacts for their structures and organizations. They're accountable for organizational strategy and risk mitigation. And importantly, they approve investments and resources. So without a strategic understanding at the top of the decision-making hierarchy, that ESG is valuable and needs to be authentic and integrated, the potential for innovation and value creation is diminished. And let's face it, there's lots of reasons why leadership may not buy into ESG. They're successful for a reason. They may have a vested interest in the status quo and not want to explore disruptive solutions. But conversely, some of today's strongest leaders are looking at ESG as an innovation opportunity, as well as a competitive advantage and a pathway to capital. So how do you know what your leaders are thinking, right? Design thinking would suggest that tools like an empathy map may be useful for understanding where your leadership is currently situated, right? And empathy mapping just looks at what is the ESG goal that we want leadership to reach, and then takes a 360-degree view of what evidence is available to understand their perspectives, right? What are they seeing? What are they saying? Who are they listening to and what are they doing? And there's plenty of places to look for data, right? Company reports, media, if they're on panels, doing town halls, internal materials. So mapping this and then appreciating what is discovered in this phase to think, how might they be feeling and thinking about ESG, right? Having an empathetic experience so that you'll be able to better understand, but also better frame solution to solve for your leadership's pains and strengthen their gains. So the insights of using an empathetic tool, research tool, like an empathy map, can inform the ways in which you communicate in order to bring the value of ESG into focus and to increase buy-in and secure resources for innovation and change. And I guess our third and last example of how design thinking and ESG connect is around the role of collaboration and co-design. And I am aware that this isn't just about ESG. In general, collaboration and co-design, it just creates more value. It's more inclusive. It drives authentic understanding. It drives buy-in. But what we often hear from participants in our designing ESG program is that unless it's a core mandate, sustainability and ESG just feels like more work, an add-on to people's daily opportunities and responsibilities, right? And in early days of ESG, it's often someone from the human resources team or the marketing department who is asked to lead ESG off the side of their desk, right? And that's a challenge because ESG opportunities can be generated across business units to maximize positive impacts. So taking a design research approach would involve research with diverse colleagues, right? And having guided but open conversations to explore how are environmental, social, and governance issues showing up in their space, right? What are the key performance indicators in their position that can relate to E, S, and G? And there is a wide range of ESG reports and rankings that are publicly available that you can access to be able to actually find case studies, best practices, so you can review and consider and inspire with your colleagues. From an internal organization perspective, there's a much better chance of solving the right problems and identifying the best opportunities if you work closely to learn from and collaborate with stakeholders and colleagues. And it all starts by engaging the people who experience the challenges or the situations first. I'll give you an example. If someone's working in procurement and supply chain, perhaps they've been told they need to find ways to decrease carbon in the supply chain, perhaps in response to new carbon pricing or anticipated carbon pricing. So researching sustainable procurement and best practices in the sector and being able to present these inspiring works to your colleagues can open discussions in a way that is generative, relevant, and using an open-ended style to allow new ideas to emerge. Not only is this useful from a strategic perspective, this often leads to co-designing solutions. And as someone who's an entrepreneur in an organization, this is a really good place to be because co-design builds ownership, it builds accountability, right? It's an inclusive approach. It leverages more diverse inputs and it generates well-documented value. Not only that, it's credible and authentic because difficult conversations that happen in ESG, they're hard to approach. And so being able to acknowledge that dynamic and fast-moving nature in a way that means something to the end user is really essential. Working collaboratively, lastly, can also be rewarding because you can use a prototyping and iterative approach, right? Always learning and applying new insights. And that makes it particularly useful in this case because it lowers the risk of action and create more psychological comfort with innovative new frameworks like ES&G. Okay, so those are 3 examples of how design thinking can add value to the essential work that needs to be done to counter the untenable impacts that our current system are placing on people and on the planet. And before I wrap up and take questions, I just wanted to touch on the reality that doing work in climate change and in social justice is challenging. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I've personally had times where I've experienced climate anxiety and wondered whether I should leave the sector just for the sake of my own health and well-being. And I know that many of my colleagues have experienced this too. So I'd like to suggest a couple of ways in which you might want to enter this work or take care of yourself if you're already doing the work. Right? One is adopting an appreciative inquiry approach. This is a way of identifying what is positive and connecting to those positives in ways that heighten energy and action for change. And I've got a link with more information in the slide deck here. And another great resource that I found is sort of finding a community that feels this way and what they are using from a mindset perspective to be able to persevere. And The Future We Choose is a really great example of a book that really addresses climate from a mindset of optimism and helped me reframe the future as abundant and thriving. Yeah, so I hope you found this information useful. I hope your understanding of ESG has deepened. perhaps that your appreciation for design thinking might be a useful way to approach ESG, and how you might take care of yourself if you're doing this work. So thank you for listening and for the activity that I've noticed in the chat. I would love to hear from you and do my best to answer any questions you might have about the topic. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Patricio.